The crowd gathered thick that autumn morning in Redemption Creek, their faces hungry for spectacle, and what they witnessed would burn itself into the town's memory for generations to come. Samuel Bridger stood at the edge of that gathering, 43 years weathered into his face, his hands still carrying the morning's work from his cattle ranch 5 miles north. He had come to town for supplies, not for shame, not for the kind of human degradation that was unfolding on the courthouse steps. A man named Silas Crane, gambler, drunk coward, was offering his own flesh and blood to settle his debts. 3 daughters standing there like livestock at market, their eyes cast down, their spirits already half broken by the father who had failed them in every way a father could fail. The eldest girl, maybe 19, stood with her shoulders squared despite everything, protecting the 2 younger ones behind her with nothing but her presence. The middle girl, 17 perhaps, burned with a fury that kept her spine straight, even as tears threatened. And the youngest, barely 15, trembled like a leaf in wind, her innocence being stripped away with every leering glance from the crowd. Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, a fissure that had been sealed tight since his wife Martha passed 3 winters back, since he'd been left alone to raise 3 sons on hard land with harder lessons. But this was different than hardship. This was cruelty, and cruelty demanded an answer. The auctioneer's voice rang out with numbers, with bids, with the casual evil of men who saw opportunity in suffering, and Samuel found his boots carrying him forward before his mind had fully decided, found his voice calling out a sum that silenced the crowd, found himself becoming something he'd never imagined, a man standing between innocence and its destruction. He did not buy them. He would tell himself this truth every day afterward. He intervened, he interrupted, he placed himself as a barrier between what was happening and what should never happen. But the money changed hands nonetheless, and the law, cold, indifferent, bureaucratic, called it a transaction. The 3 girls looked at him with eyes that held no hope, only exhaustion. They had learned not to hope, not to trust, not to believe that any man could be different from the one who had just sold them. And Samuel understood in that moment that whatever came next would require more than money, more than good intentions. It would require time and patience and a mercy he wasn't sure he still possessed. Silas Crane took his payment and slithered away into whatever darkness would have him, and Samuel was left standing with 3 broken souls who were now, by the law's cold reckoning, his responsibility. But he would make them understand, if it took years, that they were not property, they were people, and his ranch would be their sanctuary, not their prison. The wagon ride north began in silence, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than words ever could, the kind that carries the weight of trauma and terror and the terrible unknown. And Samuel knew that the easy part was over. Everything that mattered would come in the days and months and years ahead. The Bridger Ranch sat in a valley where the creek ran clear and the grass grew high. A modest house, a sturdy barn, a life built by honest labor and maintained by discipline. It had been a home once before Martha died, and Samuel had spent 3 years trying to remember what a home felt like. His sons waited on the porch, Jacob at 22, already carrying himself like a man who understood duty. Nathan at 20, with his easy smile and gentle manner. And Daniel, barely 18, still growing into himself, still soft around the edges where life hadn't yet hardened him. The boys had been told what their father intended, and they had accepted it without question, because that was how Samuel had raised them. To see suffering and to answer it, to stand up when standing up was required. But telling them and showing them were 2 different things, and now 3 terrified girls were climbing down from the wagon into their new reality. Samuel spoke plainly, his voice carrying across the yard to his sons and to the girls alike. He told them the rules were simple: respect, honesty, work, and freedom. Freedom to leave whenever they wished, freedom to speak their minds, freedom to be more than what they'd been forced to be. The eldest girl, she gave her name as Catherine, though her voice barely rose above a whisper, studied Samuel with eyes that calculated every angle, every possible trap, every hidden danger. She was a survivor, and survivors don't trust words, they trust actions, and actions take time to prove themselves. The middle girl, Elizabeth, watched with defiance simmering just below her surface. She had been burned by trust before, had seen promises broken, had learned that anger was safer than hope, and she wore that anger like armor, daring anyone to try to reach past it. The youngest, Anna, simply wept, quiet tears that she tried to hide, that she wiped away with trembling hands, that spoke of a soul too tender for the world's cruelty. And Samuel's heart broke for her in ways he couldn't name, because she reminded him of what innocence looked like when it was being murdered by circumstance. That first night, the girls stayed in the spare room, Martha's sewing room once upon a time, and Samuel heard them whispering through the walls, planning probably, preparing for whatever horror they assumed would come, because horror was all they knew from men, all they'd been taught to expect. He sat on the porch with his sons, smoking his pipe, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. And he told them the truth, that this would not be easy, that trust had to be earned, that they would need to be better men than most men ever tried to be. And his sons nodded, because they understood, because he had raised them to understand. Jacob spoke then, his voice quiet but firm. He said the girls deserved peace, deserved safety, deserved to heal at their own pace. And Samuel felt pride surge through him, because this was what he'd hoped to build, not just a ranch, but a place where mercy could take root and grow. Nathan added that they should give the girls work, real work, the kind that makes a person feel useful rather than useless. Because purpose was part of healing, part of rebuilding what had been torn down. And Samuel agreed, knowing that idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts led back to darkness. Daniel said nothing, but his eyes held tears. He was the youngest, the most tender-hearted, the one who felt everything too deeply. And Samuel put a hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance that feeling wasn't weakness, that compassion was the strongest thing a man could carry. Inside the house, in that small room, Catherine held her sisters close. She'd been holding them close for years, being the mother their real mother had abandoned, being the father their real father had failed to be. And she promised them, in whispers, that she would keep them safe, even though she had no idea if safety was even possible anymore. The night stretched long. The darkness outside matched the darkness in 3 young hearts. But somewhere in that darkness, without anyone quite noticing, the first tiny seed of possibility was planted. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, not all men were monsters, not all promises were lies, not all homes were prisons. The first weeks passed like a slow thaw after a brutal winter. Cautious, uncertain, fragile, the girls moved through the ranch like ghosts, present but not present, existing but not living. And the Bridger men gave them space, gave them time, gave them the rarest gift of all, the gift of not being pressed, not being demanded of, not being used. Catherine took to the kitchen with fierce determination. She had cooked for her sisters for years, had learned to make meals from nothing, had turned survival into an art form. And now, in this kitchen with actual supplies, actual ingredients, she found something resembling purpose, found that feeding people who said thank you felt different than feeding people who expected everything. Elizabeth worked the garden with an intensity that bordered on violence. She dug into the earth like she was trying to bury something, or maybe unearth something, her hands blistering and bleeding until Nathan quietly showed her how to wrap them, how to pace herself, how to let the work be meditation rather than punishment. Anna stayed close to the animals, the horses, the chickens, the barn cats that wandered through looking for mice. She spoke to them in soft voices, found in them a gentleness that humans had rarely shown her. And Daniel often worked nearby, not intruding, just present, just showing her through silence that she wasn't alone. Jacob maintained the boundaries his father had set: respectful distance, consistent kindness, unwavering reliability. He woke at the same time each morning, did his work with quiet efficiency, never raised his voice, never made sudden movements. He was teaching them through example that some men could be steady, could be safe, could be trusted to be who they claimed to be. The girls watched the Bridger men constantly, waiting for the mask to slip, waiting for the real intentions to emerge. But weeks turned into months, and the mask never slipped, because there was no mask. This was simply who they were: men who worked hard, who kept their word, who treated respect like it mattered. Catherine found herself confused by this, confusion being the first crack in her defensive walls, because Jacob would ask her opinion about meals, about supplies, about ranch decisions, and he would listen to her answers, would actually consider what she said, would implement her suggestions, and she didn't know what to do with being heard, being valued, being treated like her thoughts mattered. Elizabeth discovered that Nathan could match her fire without being burned by it. When she snapped at him, he didn't retaliate or retreat. He just smiled, made a joke, deflected her anger like water off stone. And slowly, grudgingly, she found herself smiling back, found her anger losing its edge, found that maybe not everyone needed to be kept at sword's length. Anna began to bloom in small ways, a laugh that escaped when Daniel told a silly story, a moment where she forgot to flinch when Samuel walked past, a morning where she woke up and didn't immediately remember to be afraid. These moments were tiny, fragile, but they were real, and they accumulated like drops of water that would eventually carve through stone. Samuel watched it all with careful hope. He knew that healing wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks, that trust built slowly could be shattered quickly. But he also knew that what they were building here was important, was right, was the kind of thing that justified a man's existence. He was giving these girls a chance to be more than what the world had tried to make them. One evening, Catherine spoke at dinner, actually spoke, not just whispered or murmured, but used her voice with something approaching confidence. She talked about a recipe her mother had made once, before everything fell apart, before Silas Crane drank away their future, and the table fell silent, not in judgment but in witness, in acknowledgement that she had shared something real, something that came from the person beneath the survival instincts. Jacob asked her questions about it, gentle questions, and she answered them. A conversation, actual conversation. The first they'd had that wasn't about work or necessity. And when it ended, she looked surprised by herself, surprised that she'd let her guard down, surprised that nothing bad had happened because of it. That night, in their room, Elizabeth whispered to Catherine that maybe they were going to be okay. Maybe, just maybe, they had found something real. And Catherine didn't disagree, didn't shut it down, didn't protect them with pessimism. She just held her sisters close and let herself hope, just for a moment, that Elizabeth might be right. The first phase was ending, the phase of pure survival, of constant vigilance, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, a second phase was beginning, the phase where healing became possible, where trust could take root, where 3 broken girls could start to imagine becoming whole women. Spring came hard that year, storms rolling down from the mountains, the creek swelling to twice its size, the land turning muddy and treacherous. But the ranch endured, because the ranch had been built to endure, and the people on it were learning that they too could weather storms they'd once thought would destroy them. Catherine had become something close to herself again, not the girl she'd been before Silas Crane destroyed their family, but someone new, someone stronger, someone who carried her scars without letting them define her. She ran the household now with quiet confidence, and Jacob had started looking at her with something in his eyes that went beyond respect, something that made her heart do strange, frightening, wonderful things. Elizabeth had found in Nathan a kind of kinship, They argued constantly, but it was the arguing of equals, of two people who challenged each other without trying to wound. She had stopped seeing every man as a threat, had started seeing individuals, had started understanding that masculinity wasn't inherently dangerous when it was wrapped in genuine goodness. Anna had attached herself to Daniel like a shadow. He brought out a lightness in her that no one had seen before. A playfulness that must have existed once, long ago, before trauma had taught her to be small and quiet and invisible. She laughed now, actually laughed, and the sound of it made Samuel's eyes water with gratitude. But peace, as Samuel had learned from long experience, was always temporary, and the past, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Silas Crane returned on a Tuesday afternoon, drunk, desperate, and dangerous. He rode up to the ranch with two other men, hired guns with dead eyes and quick hands, and he came not with apologies or remorse, but with demands, with claims of ownership, with legal papers that he swore gave him the right to take his daughters back. The girls heard his voice from inside the house and froze, 3 hearts stopping simultaneously, 3 bodies reverting to the terror they'd worked so hard to overcome. Catherine's hand went to her throat. Elizabeth's face went pale. Anna started shaking so hard she had to sit down. Samuel met Silas at the property line. His sons flanked him, and though none of them were wearing guns, this was a working ranch, not a battlefield, there was something in their stance that spoke of immovable resistance. Samuel had protected these girls from sale, and he would protect them from reclamation, even if it meant blood in the dirt. Silas ranted and raved, claimed that debts or no debts, those girls were his, that blood gave him rights, that the law would side with a father over a stranger. And Samuel let him finish, let him exhaust himself, let him reveal himself for what he truly was. A man who saw his own children as property, as assets, as things to be used and discarded. When Silas finally fell silent, Samuel spoke. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. He told Silas that the girls were not returning, that this ranch was their home now, that whatever legal claim he thought he had was worth less than the paper it was written on, because there were laws, and then there was justice, and sometimes the two things weren't the same. Silas threatened violence. His hand moved toward his gun, and his hired men shifted their weight, preparing for whatever blood would come. But before anything could happen, before the world could tip into irreversible darkness, a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Catherine emerged from the house, her sisters behind her, holding hands, holding each other up, and she walked toward her father with her head high, with her fear swallowed down, with every ounce of courage she'd been building over months of healing. And she told him in a voice that shook but didn't break, that he had lost them the day he chose cards and whiskey over love, lost them the day he stood on those courthouse steps and treated them like cattle. She told him they were staying, told him that Samuel Bridger had given them what Silas never had, safety, dignity, choice, told him that if he truly loved them, he would leave and never come back, would let them have the life he'd stolen and they'd finally found. Silas looked at his daughters like he was seeing them for the first time, or perhaps seeing himself reflected in their eyes, seeing what he'd become, seeing the wreckage of his failures made flesh. And something in him, some small part that might have been human once, seemed to crumble. He had no answer for their strength, no response to their unity, no weapon against their simple, devastating truth. The hired guns looked at each other and then at Silas. They'd been paid to intimidate, maybe to kill, but they hadn't been paid to fight 3 young women who were willing to stand their ground. And slowly, carefully, they backed away, leaving Silas alone with his shame. He left without another word, climbed back on his horse and rode away, and nobody at the Bridger Ranch ever saw him again. They heard later that he'd drunk himself to death in some mining town 3 territories over, that he'd died alone and unmourned. And while the girls grieved for the father he could have been, they didn't grieve for the father he was. That night Catherine wept. Wept for the loss of what should have been, for the childhood she'd never had, for the father who'd chosen everything else over them. And Jacob held her, just held her, let her cry without trying to fix it, without trying to minimize it, just bearing witness to her pain. And in that moment she understood that this was what love looked like. Not grand gestures, but presence, steadiness, the willingness to be there in the darkness. Summer burned hot across the valley, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the work feel twice as hard. But the ranch thrived because the people on it thrived, because broken things had been given time to mend, because seeds planted in winter were finally bearing fruit. Catherine and Jacob had stopped pretending there wasn't something between them. The glances had become too obvious, the accidental touches too frequent, the way they orbited each other too deliberate to be coincidence. They worked side by side in a rhythm that felt ancient, felt destined, felt like two pieces of something that had always been meant to fit together. Jacob asked Samuel's permission before he asked Catherine anything, sat his father down one evening and spoke of intentions, of commitment, of building a future. And Samuel, looking at his eldest son, this man who carried responsibility like it weighed nothing, felt pride swell so large it nearly choked him. He gave his blessing, gave it gladly, gave it knowing that Jacob would honor it with every breath he took. When Jacob asked Catherine to marry him, he did it simply. No elaborate performance, no dramatic gesture, just honest words spoken under a sunset that painted the sky in shades of fire. He told her she'd saved him as much as he'd saved her, that she'd taught him what strength really meant, that he wanted to spend whatever days he had left making her happy. And she said yes through tears, said yes with her whole heart, said yes to a future she'd stopped believing could exist. Elizabeth and Nathan's path was more complicated. They fought constantly, challenged each other relentlessly, pushed and pulled like two forces that couldn't quite figure out if they were attracted or repelled. But underneath the friction was something deeper. Something both of them were afraid to name, afraid to claim, afraid to believe could be real. Nathan finally cornered her one day in the garden, told her plainly that he loved her fire, loved her fight, loved everything she tried to hide behind her anger, told her that he saw her, the real her, and that he wasn't going anywhere. And Elizabeth, who had built walls higher than mountains, felt those walls crack, felt something pour through the fissures, felt herself falling into something she'd sworn she'd never risk again. She kissed him then, kissed him like she was drowning and he was air, kissed him like she was angry about loving him, kissed him like she was claiming something she'd been denied her entire life. And Nathan kissed her back with all the gentleness and patience he'd shown her from the beginning, letting her lead, letting her take what she needed, letting her find her own way to trust. Anna and Daniel were softer. Their love was quiet where the others were loud, gentle where the others were fierce. They found each other in small moments, Daniel teaching Anna to read, Anna teaching Daniel to see beauty in ordinary things. They were healing together, two wounded souls binding each other's breaks with tenderness. Daniel asked her to marry him by the creek, gave her a ring made of twisted copper, nothing fancy, just something he'd crafted himself. Told her she made the world feel safe, made him want to be better, made him understand what his father had tried to teach him about mercy and goodness. And Anna said yes, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, but he saw it in her eyes, saw it in her smile, saw it in the way she finally, fully, completely let herself be happy. Samuel watched his sons become husbands, watched the girls become women, watched his ranch transform into something larger than he'd imagined. He had wanted to save them, but they had saved him too, had filled the emptiness Martha's death had left, had reminded him that life continued, that love continued, that purpose continued even after loss. The weddings happened in autumn, 3 ceremonies on 3 consecutive days, the whole town of Redemption Creek turning out to witness. And if anyone remembered that morning years ago when these same girls had stood on courthouse steps being auctioned, they had the decency not to mention it, because what mattered wasn't the past, what mattered was the present. And the present was three women choosing their own futures, claiming their own happiness, writing their own endings. Catherine married Jacob in a dress she'd sewn herself, white cotton, simple, beautiful, and when she walked toward him, her sisters on either side of her, she walked with a confidence that had been earned, had been built from nothing, had been forged in fire and suffering, and ultimately triumph, and Jacob looked at her like she was the sun and moon and stars all at once. Elizabeth married Nathan in a dress that Anna had helped her make, blue as the sky, adorned with wildflowers. And when the preacher asked if she took this man, she answered with her characteristic fire, loud enough for everyone to hear, claiming it, owning it, declaring to the world that she was choosing this, that nobody had chosen for her. And Nathan grinned like he'd won the greatest prize ever offered. Anna married Daniel in a dress that Catherine had stitched with love, soft yellow, like morning light. And when Daniel slipped that copper ring on her finger, when he kissed her in front of God and community, she realized she was no longer the broken girl on those courthouse steps. She was Anna Bridger now, beloved wife, treasured soul, someone with a name and a place and a future. The celebrations lasted through the night, music and dancing and food and joy, and Samuel stood apart from it all for a moment, just watching, just taking it in. 3 sons married to 3 women who had become his daughters, a family built not from blood alone, but from choice, from commitment, from the radical act of offering mercy when the world offered none. He thought of Martha then, wished she could see this, wished she could know what their sons had become, wished she could meet these remarkable women who had transformed their lives, and perhaps she did see it. Perhaps she was there in spirit. Perhaps she was smiling at how love had multiplied, how their small family had grown into something magnificent. The years that followed were marked by growth, not just of the ranch, though it prospered, but of the people who called it home. Children were born, family expanded, roots went deep into soil that had once seemed too hard for anything to take hold. Catherine gave birth to a son first, named him Samuel, after the man who had saved her, who had given her a chance to be more than what the world had tried to make her. And when old Samuel held that baby, held his grandson, he wept openly, unashamed, because this child represented victory, represented the triumph of mercy over cruelty, represented the future they'd all fought to build. Jacob was a father, like his own father had been, steady, patient, present. He taught young Samuel about work and honor and treating people with dignity, and Catherine watched him with their son and fell more in love with him every day because he was proving that good men existed, that good men could raise good sons, that the cycle of pain didn't have to continue forever. Elizabeth had twins, a boy and a girl, loud and fierce and stubborn, just like their mother. Nathan joked that he was outnumbered now, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. He handled their fire with the same gentle humor he'd used on Elizabeth, teaching them that strength didn't mean hardness, that passion could be channeled toward building rather than destroying. Anna had 3 children in quick succession, 2 girls and a boy, all of them gentle-souled like their parents. Daniel raised them with tenderness, showed them beauty in everyday things, taught them to see the world's goodness even when darkness threatened. And Anna, who had been so broken once, discovered that she was whole enough to pour love into these small lives, whole enough to mother without fear. The ranch expanded. More land, more cattle, more hands hired to help with the work, but it never lost its character, never became just a business. It remained a place where broken people could find healing, where second chances were offered freely, where mercy was practiced as policy. Samuel had built more than a ranch. He'd built a legacy, and that legacy was written in the lives he'd touched. The town of Redemption Creek changed too, slowly, subtly, but changed nonetheless. The story of the Bridger family had spread, had become legend, had inspired others to look at suffering and choose to intervene rather than walk past. The girls who had been auctioned on courthouse steps were now women running businesses in town, teaching school, serving on church committees. They had become pillars of the community, proof that people could rise from ashes. Samuel grew older. His hair went white, his back bent slightly, his hands developed tremors that made fine work difficult. But his mind remained sharp, his heart remained open, his commitment to his principles never wavered. He watched his grandchildren grow with the satisfaction of a man who knew he'd done right, who knew he'd used his life for good, who knew that when his time came, he would face whatever came next with a clear conscience. But even in times of peace, even in times of prosperity, the past had a way of sending reminders, whispers that not everyone had found healing, that not everyone had been saved, that the world still held darkness that needed confronting. Word reached them one winter that Silas Crane was dead, died alone in a mining camp, drowned in whiskey and regret. The girls received the news with complicated emotions, grief for what could have been, relief that he could hurt them no more, sadness that he'd never chosen redemption when it had been offered. They buried the news like they'd buried him, acknowledged it and moved on, because their lives were about forward motion now, not backward dwelling. Catherine spoke at dinner the night they learned of his death, told her sisters that they had to forgive him, not for his sake, but for theirs, because carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And they did forgive him, or at least they tried, or at least they committed to the process of forgiveness, understanding that some wounds take lifetimes to fully heal. The ranch had become a symbol. People came from neighboring territories to see the place where 3 girls had been rescued, where mercy had been practiced, where a different kind of justice had been served. And while the Bridgers didn't think of themselves as special or heroic, they welcomed visitors, shared their story, hoped that it might inspire others to choose compassion when cruelty was easier. Samuel began writing things down, his memories, his thoughts, his philosophy. He wanted his grandchildren to understand not just what had happened, but why, wanted them to know that choosing good wasn't always simple, that mercy required courage, that standing up for others often meant standing alone. He wrote late into the nights, his trembling hands forming words that he hoped would outlive him. Jacob read some of what his father wrote, felt humbled by it, felt challenged by it, felt responsible for carrying it forward. He understood that the legacy wasn't just the ranch or the family, but the principles that had built them, the commitment to seeing people as people rather than as obstacles or opportunities. And he vowed to pass those principles to his own children, to keep the fire burning that Samuel had lit. The grandchildren grew up hearing stories of courage and redemption, stories of second chances and healing, stories of how their grandmothers had been saved and had saved themselves. And those stories shaped them, molded them, taught them that they came from strength, that they carried the responsibility to offer mercy to others, just as mercy had been offered to their family. Winter passed into spring again, seasons cycling as they always had, as they always would, but the people who experienced those seasons were changed, were shaped by time and choice and consequence. And the Bridger Ranch stood as testament to what humans could build when they chose love over indifference, action over apathy, mercy over judgment. 10 years after the weddings, the Bridger Ranch faced its greatest challenge, the kind that tested everything they'd built, everything they believed, everything they'd sworn to uphold. A girl appeared at their door one morning, no more than 16, bruised, terrified, running from something she couldn't name, but that showed in every flinch, every shallow breath, every moment of panic in her eyes. She had heard stories of the Bridger family, had traveled 3 territories to find them, had gambled everything on the hope that mercy extended once might be extended again. Samuel was gone by then, passed peacefully 2 winters prior, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see his legacy take root. But his sons remained, And his daughters-in-law remained, and the principles he'd instilled remained like bedrock beneath everything they built. Catherine took the girl in without hesitation, saw herself in those frightened eyes, remembered what it felt like to have nowhere to turn, nobody to trust, no hope for tomorrow. She cleaned the girl's wounds, fed her, clothed her, and most importantly, she listened. Let the story pour out in broken pieces, never judging, never rushing, just bearing witness to pain that needed acknowledgement. The girl's name was Rose, or at least that's what she called herself, and she was running from a man who'd bought her from her family, who'd used her in ways that made speech difficult, who'd made her believe she was worthless, was broken, was beyond all possibility of redemption or healing. And Catherine recognized that belief, had carried it herself once, knew how deeply it could root itself in a soul. Jacob called a family meeting. His brothers, his wife, his cousins, everyone who carried the Bridger name, and he posed the question simply. Would they help this girl the way Samuel had helped Catherine and her sisters? Would they extend the same mercy, take the same risk, commit to the same long road of healing? The answer was unanimous. Of course they would help her, of course they would protect her, of course they would offer sanctuary, because that was who they were. That was what the Bridger name meant. That was the legacy Samuel had died believing they would carry forward. To turn away now would be to betray everything, to invalidate all the suffering that had been transformed into purpose. But mercy came with cost. The man Rose was running from was powerful, wealthy, connected. He had hired men searching for her, had offered rewards, had made it clear that he considered her his property and would stop at nothing to reclaim what he believed was his. And helping Rose meant making an enemy, meant putting everyone at risk, meant potentially paying with blood for principles that demanded defending. Jacob consulted with his brothers, asked them honestly if they were willing to stand, to fight if fighting became necessary, to risk what they'd built for a girl they didn't know. And Nathan and Daniel both answered without hesitation. They would stand, they would fight, they would die before they'd let another girl be dragged back into slavery, masquerading as legal ownership. The confrontation came 3 weeks later. 6 men rode up to the ranch, professional killers, hiding behind legal papers and manufactured authority. They demanded Rose's return, claimed legal right, threatened violence if their demands weren't met. And the Bridger men met them at the property line with rifles and resolution, making clear that legal or not, right or not, Rose was under their protection and would remain so. The standoff lasted hours. Tense negotiation, veiled threats, the kind of standoff where everyone knows blood is coming, but nobody wants to be the one to start it. And then Elizabeth did something unexpected, something brilliant, something that proved she'd learned more from her years of healing than anyone had realized. She rode into town alone, found the sheriff, found the judge, found the newspaper editor, and she told them Rose's story, told them about the man who'd bought her, told them about the system that allowed such things to happen in a civilized society. And she challenged them publicly, loudly, fearlessly, to decide what kind of community they wanted to be, one that protected the powerful or one that protected the vulnerable. The town responded, maybe because Elizabeth's own story was well known, maybe because shame is a powerful motivator, maybe because there were more good people than bad and they'd been waiting for permission to act. But they responded, and they made clear that Rose was under their protection too, that the Bridgers didn't stand alone, that mercy was their community value as much as it was the Bridger family value. The hired guns left, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, facing a town unified against them, and the man who'd sent them eventually gave up, found easier prey, moved on to some place where people didn't care as much. And Rose was safe, was free, was given the same chance Catherine and her sisters had been given, the chance to become more than what trauma had tried to make her. Catherine took Rose under her wing, taught her what Elizabeth and Anna had taught her, that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that worth wasn't determined by what had been done to you, but by what you chose to do with the life you'd been given. And Rose learned slowly, painfully, beautifully, that she could be whole again. The experience changed the family, deepened their commitment, strengthened their resolve, made them understand that mercy wasn't something you offered once and then forgot about. It was a practice, a discipline, a daily choice to see suffering and respond, rather than turn away. And they understood that Samuel's legacy demanded this of them, demanded that they continue what he'd started until their own dying days. Rose eventually married one of the ranch hands, a good man who'd proven himself steady, who'd courted her with patience, who'd understood that love meant waiting, meant letting her heal at her own pace, meant accepting that some scars never fully disappear, but don't have to define the future. And when they married, the whole family celebrated because it was another victory, another life reclaimed, another testament to the power of mercy. Jacob stood at that wedding and thought about his father, wished Samuel could see this, could see how his principles had multiplied, how his commitment to mercy had spread like seeds on the wind, how the family he'd built was continuing to build, continuing to grow, continuing to offer sanctuary to those who needed it. And he felt the weight of responsibility, but also the privilege of carrying something larger than himself forward into the future. That night, after the celebration ended, after the guests had gone home, after the family had cleaned up and said their good nights, Jacob sat on the porch where his father had sat so many times before, smoking a pipe, watching the stars, thinking about legacy and responsibility and the strange, beautiful ways that mercy could change the world. And he understood finally what Samuel had understood, that saving one person might seem small in the grand scheme of things, might seem insignificant compared to the world's vast suffering. But to that one person, it was everything. It was the difference between darkness and light, between death and life, between despair and hope. And if enough people chose to save one person, if enough families committed to mercy, then maybe, just maybe, the world could be transformed one life at a time. Decades rolled past, like rivers flowing to the sea, inevitable, unstoppable, carrying everything forward whether people were ready or not. The Bridger Ranch had become an institution, a legend, a place that existed as much in story as in reality. And the people who'd built it were entering their twilight, looking back at lives well lived, at choices well made, at mercy well practiced. Catherine was 73 when the cough started, the kind of cough that doesn't go away, that signals the body's slow surrender to time's relentless demands. Jacob tended her with the same steady devotion he'd shown for 50 years, never complaining, never wavering, just present in the way he'd always been present. And she died on a spring morning with her hand in his, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, leaving behind a legacy of strength and survival and transformation. Jacob followed her within a year, died quietly in his sleep, his heart simply deciding it had beaten long enough, that it was time to rest. And at his funeral, people came from 6 territories to pay respects, to tell stories, to acknowledge that this man had lived a life that mattered, that had touched countless others, that had proven mercy wasn't weakness, but the strongest force humans could wield. Elizabeth outlived them both, ornery and fierce until the very end, still arguing with Nathan about everything and nothing, still burning with the fire that had defined her. She died at 81, sharp-minded and sharp-tongued, refusing to go gentle, making death work for her attention, and Nathan, lost without his sparring partner, without his love, followed her 6 months later, dying of what the doctor called heart failure, but what everyone knew was heartbreak. Anna lived longest, gentle Anna, soft Anna, Anna who'd been so broken and had become so whole. She made it to 87, surrounded by gardens she'd planted, by animals she'd raised, by children and grandchildren who carried her tenderness forward into the world. Daniel had died years before, and she'd carried on alone, but not lonely, sustained by memory, by family, by the knowledge that she'd lived a life filled with love. When Anna finally passed, the last of the three sisters who'd stood on those courthouse steps so many years ago, the town of Redemption Creek held a ceremony, erected a monument, made sure the story would be remembered. 3 girls rescued, 3 lives transformed, 3 women who'd proven that trauma didn't have to be destiny, that healing was possible, that mercy could change everything. The ranch continued, run by grandchildren now, then great-grandchildren, generation after generation, carrying forward the principles that Samuel had established, that the girls had embodied, that had become the foundation of everything the family meant. And though the original players were gone, their presence remained, woven into the land itself, into the values that governed how the family operated. The story spread further than anyone could have imagined, became the subject of books, of songs, of sermons preached in churches across the frontier. People pointed to the bridges as proof that individuals could make a difference, that choosing mercy over convenience mattered, that standing up for the vulnerable was always right, even when it wasn't easy. And the family bore that responsibility with humility, understanding that they were simply carriers of something larger than themselves. Young people came to the ranch seeking guidance, asking how to live lives that mattered, how to make choices that honored human dignity, how to practice mercy in a world that often rewarded cruelty. And the Bridger descendants shared what they'd learned, that mercy required courage, required commitment, required being willing to sacrifice comfort for principle, but that the rewards, while not always immediate or obvious, were eternal. The town erected a second monument eventually, this one for Samuel Bridger, the man who'd started it all, and the inscription read simply, "He saw suffering and answered." No elaborate praise, no flowery language, just the basic truth of what he'd done, what he'd committed his life to doing, what he'd taught his sons and their children and their children's children to do. Visitors came from around the world, people who'd heard the story, who wanted to see the place where it happened, who needed to believe that such things were possible. And they walked the land that Samuel had walked, stood where Catherine and Elizabeth and Anna had stood, tried to imagine the courage it had taken, the faith it had required, the love that had transformed everything. The ranch became a sanctuary officially, a place where those fleeing abuse, escaping trauma, running from impossible situations could find refuge, could find healing, could find a path forward. It was formalized, institutionalized, made permanent, ensuring that the work Samuel started would continue long after everyone who'd known him personally was dust. And late at night, when the wind blew across the valley, when the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, when the creek whispered its eternal song, people swore they could feel them there. Samuel and Martha, Catherine and Jacob, Elizabeth and Nathan, Anna and Daniel, still watching, still guiding, still blessing the work that continued in their names. The story didn't have an ending, not really, because good work never ends. It just transforms, it multiplies, it spreads. Mercy begets mercy. Healing enables healing. Courage inspires courage. And what began with one man's decision to intervene, to disrupt, to offer sanctuary when sanctuary was desperately needed, became a movement, became a legacy, became eternal. Children born a century after that auction day still learned the story, still heard about the 3 girls on the courthouse steps, about the rancher who refused to walk past, about the family that chose each other rather than being bound by blood alone. And those children understood that they too had choices to make, that they too could see suffering and answer, that they too could practice mercy in a world that needed it desperately. The Bridger name became synonymous with integrity, with compassion, with standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And while the family never sought fame or recognition, never wanted glory or praise, They accepted the responsibility that came with the name, understood that carrying it meant carrying Samuel's vision forward, meant living lives worthy of the sacrifice and courage that had built their foundation. And so the ranch endured, through droughts and floods, through economic collapse and recovery, through wars and peace, through all the chaos and change that time inevitably brings. It endured because it was built on something solid, something true, something that couldn't be shaken by circumstance or worn down by years. It was built on mercy, on the radical belief that every person deserved dignity, deserved a chance, deserved to be more than what the world's cruelty had tried to make them. The sun set over the valley one final time in this telling, casting long shadows, painting the sky in golds and purples and deep reds, and somewhere, in the space between memory and myth, between history and hope, Samuel Bridger smiled, because his work had endured, his vision had multiplied, his mercy had echoed through generations. And in the end, what more could any person ask than to have lived a life that mattered, that made the world gentler, that proved love was stronger than hate? This is how mercy works, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, though those have their place, but in daily choices, in consistent commitment, in refusing to walk past suffering even when walking past would be easier. This is how lives are transformed, how legacies are built, how the world inches slowly, painfully, beautifully toward justice. And the story continues, will always continue, because somewhere, right now, someone is making the choice Samuel made, is seeing suffering and answering, is offering mercy when judgment would be simpler. And in that moment, in that choice, the legacy lives on, proving that one person, one family, one act of courage can ripple outward forever, can change everything, can make the difference between darkness and light. The Bridger Ranch stands still, weathered but unbroken, aged but alive, a testament carved in wood and stone and spirit. And as long as it stands, as long as the story is told, as long as people remember that mercy matters, then Samuel's vision endures, Catherine's strength inspires, Elizabeth's fire burns, Anna's gentleness heals. And the world is reminded that we are all, every one of us, called to see suffering and answer, called to offer mercy, called to build legacies of love in a world that desperately needs them. And as the last light faded over the Bridger Ranch, mercy didn't end, it just passed on, maybe to you. If this story stirred something inside you, don't let it fade like dust in the wind. Tap that like button and tell us where you're listening from down in the comments. Then subscribe, because out here in the West, there's always another tale riding your way, of courage, mercy, and the kind of love that outlives time itself. Till the next ride, keep your mercy strong and your heart steady in the storm.